Hello, hello. Hello. Hello, hello. Would everybody please find their seats, please? We want to start promptly at 3:30. Thank you. Yeah. Just a note of housekeeping, if you would please make sure the sound on your phone is turned off. And we also, because of a last minute presence of RFK Jr., unfortunately, we will not be able to have a Q&A, but we hope you will be okay with that.
Oh, thank you. Thanks. Starting to feel a little bit like we're just a warm-up act here for the Stones. You know? It's warm. No, I'm saying like with the Kennedy coming, I'm starting to feel like we're like the warm-up act. Like we're like, you know, like the Stones are following us, and the Rolling Stones or something. We're like, wow, it's true.
We should wait for it. It's okay.
Yes. So you can just buy the T-shirts. And that's a serious thing.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Michael Koss, and I'm joined here with Chris Dreisbach, both alumni of Dartmouth College. Together with many alumni across the country and the world, we are concerned alumni of Dartmouth College. We want to begin by thanking everyone in the audience and on live stream for attending such an important conversation. One we feel is long past due, and one that is more important today than ever before. Today's roundtable discussion is entitled Important Conversations Never Had. What started as an open letter to the Dartmouth community, our own Vox Clementes in Deserto, has turned into a terrific event filled with esteemed panelists, each of them crying out in the wilderness in their own special way. Concerned alumni of Dartmouth College believe informed consent is a human right. And in that vein, we have assembled these individual voices together today in the hopes of having an uncensored, apolitical, data-based discussion of the scientific, ethical, and legal considerations regarding college COVID-19 vaccine mandates. Directly following today's roundtable, we are honored to be joined by environmental and public health lawyer Robert F. Kennedy Jr. in his talk entitled The Pandemic Response. Today's event was made possible by the efforts and generosity of donors, Dartmouth alumni, and many other supporters who wish to help provide a means of ensuring that the Dartmouth community and beyond have the opportunity to hear from individuals with differing opinions regarding single-minded policies that have impacted and continue to impact many of the students and faculty in the college and university setting. It therefore brings us great pleasure to bring to you today's accomplished panelists and moderator. Each carry impressive credentials which can be found on the event homepage. And now our moderator, Kim Witzak. Let's have an important conversation that was never had.
Good afternoon. I just want to say thank you for the organizers for having the vision and starting out with a simple phone call if something didn't make sense. So I just want to say thank you, and for all of you. And for all of you that are here in the audience. And so thank you for being here. I would like to tell you a little bit about myself and why I'm here as your moderator today. I like to call myself the accidental advocate. I never set out to do this work, but sometimes our greatest life purposes choose us. On August 6, 2003, while out of town on business, I received a phone call from my dad that forever changed the trajectory of my life almost 20 years ago. My husband of almost 10 years, Woody, was found hanging from the rafters of our garage, dead at age 37. Woody wasn't depressed, nor did he have a history of depression or any other mental illness. Woody had just started his dream job with a startup company and was having trouble sleeping, which is not unusual for entrepreneurs. So he went to his doctor and he was given the antidepressant Zoloft for insomnia and said it would take the edge off and help him sleep. I was out of town the first 3 weeks he was on the drug. Shortly before his death, Woody came home completely drenched in sweat. He fell to the kitchen floor, hands around his head with a vice, crying, "Help me, Kim. I don't know what's happening to me. My head's outside my body looking in. You got to help me. I'm losing my mind." We calmed him down. He called his doctor, and the doctor said, "You got to give it 4 to 6 weeks for the drug to kick in." Woody lasted 1 more week, a total of 5 weeks on the drug. The night that Woody was found, dead, the coroner asked if Woody was taking any medication. The only medication he was on was Zoloft. She proceeded to tell me that she would have to take it with her because it might have something to do with his death. Ironically, also the same day that Woody was found, the front page of our newspaper had an article that said the UK finds link between antidepressants and suicide in teens. My brother-in-law Googled Zoloft and suicide, and unbeknownst to us, the FDA held hearings in 1991 on the emergence of suicide, violence, and Prozac. At the time, the FDA and the drug companies did nothing. We never questioned the drug. Why would we? Because it was given to him by the doctor, it was sold as safe and effective, and it was FDA approved. At this time, there were no black box warnings, so that became our mission to get black box suicide warnings put on these drugs. Almost immediately, we got on the plane, we went to DC, we met with HHS, FDA, members of Congress, and the House Energy Commerce Committee, and eventually led to congressional hearings on antidepressants. Woody's story was featured in the media around the world. I also had a failure to warn wrongful death lawsuit against Pfizer and got documents out from under seal that the FDA, Pfizer, and others have long known about the risk of suicide but did not tell the public. Eventually, we got those warnings on 2004 for kids, 2006 for young adults, but that was 13 years after the FDA first had hearings and knew about it. How many lives? So I, see so many parallels in what we're seeing today. So initially, I thought this was just a systemic problem with antidepressants, but I quickly realized it's a bigger issue with our drug safety system in this country. One that is our system that is driven by commercial interests, compounded by issues such as lack of transparency, conflicts of interest, undue industry influence with marketing and PR spins, using ghostwriting and key opinion leaders. And let's see, what else? Manipulation of clinical trials, industry-funded screening tools, and the role of politics and the revolving door between Congress, the FDA, and the regulators, as well as industry. Plus, there's a plain simple fact that the system is set up to promote benefits and hide or manipulate the harms caused by medicines. And no one ever thinks it's going to happen to them until it does. So in my almost 20 years of drug safety experience, all starting with pharmas considering Woody's death an acceptable collateral damage or the cost of doing business, I had to learn how to connect the dots between pharma, the regulatory, the legal, and legislative system. I've also had the unique perspective of sitting on the FDA advisory committee for the psychopharmacologic drugs. So I see how drugs come to market, and I'm on this committee today. And to top it off, my day job, because this is not my day job, my day job is I'm in advertising and marketing. So I kind of understand the marketing machine. So when COVID hit in 2020, and the focus turned on Operation Warp Speed, I took pause. Up to this point, vaccine safety really wasn't my issue, just because I didn't have kids. However, something didn't sit right with me. With this rushed, novel, one-size-fits-all emergency use product that was eventually going to be mandated for everybody in society as the way out. Then, with Congress granting the drug companies complete legal immunity for any current, known, and future harms, red flags were raised from the beginning for me. Out of the gate, we were told science was settled and conversations around it couldn't be had. So for me, with Michael and Chris mentioned earlier, the theme of today's panel is conversations that were never had. And just a few weeks ago, many colleges and universities still had mandates until President Biden declared the public health emergency over. Well, obviously Dartmouth and and some others dropped their mandates. However, there are still hundreds of universities and colleges that are still mandating. So we need this conversation more than ever. And who knows when there might be a next one. So my ask is for you to listen with open ears, open mind, open heart to today's conversation with this amazing panel. It is my hope when today's panel ends and the conversation ends that you keep the conversation going in your own communities. So without further ado, so that's just a little background on me and why I'm here. But I want to get started on our panel. So without further ado, I want to briefly introduce each of our esteemed panel and then get the conversation rolling. So starting at the far right of me, we've got Sandy Ryder. And he is a Harvard medical trained family doctor practicing in Vermont. He was founding member of Physicians for Informed Consent. Next to him, we've got Todd Zawicki, law professor at George Mason University School of Law. He's among one of the top 10 most cited legal faculty in the field of commercial law. A 1988 graduate of Dartmouth, he also sued his university over the mandate on the premise of natural immunity and won. Next, we've got Dr. Joel Wasak. Hopefully I've said that right. All right, he's a Wisconsin orthopedic surgeon. He was one of the first to get vaccinated in December 2020. Wow. And was injured within days of his first and only Moderna shot. He is also one of the co-founders of React 19, who is the beneficiary of today's event. Next to him, we've got Martin Koldorf, a biostatistician, epidemiologist with expertise in detecting and monitoring infectious disease outbreaks and vaccine safety evaluations. He's also a professor of medicine at Harvard University, currently on leave, and is the co-author of the well-known Great Barrington Declaration. Next to him on the panel is Brooke Jackson. She is a clinical investigator, director overseeing clinical trials, over 20 years of experience. Most recently, she's a brave whistleblower that sounded the alarm on Pfizer's vaccine trial program at Ventavia. She brought a false claim act against Pfizer and the US government. So welcome, Brooke. And on screen, we are supposed to have, oh, there he is. Hi, popped up. We've got Dr. Asim Malhotra. He's a UK cardiologist and world-renowned expert in heart disease and issues with statins. He also has become a leading global critic on the mRNA vaccines after he became curious about the evidence and data. So welcome, Asim. I know we only have you for probably a short time. We're going to start the panel with him. And so welcome and share your wisdom, because it's going to set the pace for the day.
Thank you, Kim. Can everybody hear me okay? Fantastic. Well, thank you for having me here. I'm sorry I couldn't be with you there in person, but I'm attending another conference at the moment where I'm speaking. So I'm going to talk to you for a few minutes from a lens of somebody who has been very much an advocate for ethical, evidence-based medical practice and informed consent. So that's the lens I'll be speaking you briefly on the COVID vaccines and my insights on that, specifically the mRNA vaccine and Pfizer vaccine. But before I start, I'm going to give you a couple of quotes. The first one is from Stephen Hawking, which is, "The greatest enemy of knowledge is not ignorance, it is the illusion of knowledge." The second quote I'm going to give you is somebody who I personally describe as being a Stephen Hawking-like figure in medicine, and that's Professor John Ioannidis at Stanford, the most cited medical researcher in the world. And just something to think about as we start from a broader perspective. He says, "The greater the financial interests or prejudices in a given field, the less likely the research findings are to be true." When we talk about evidence-based medicine, a very elegant analytical framework that we use is called the evidence-based medicine triad. So that's using our clinical expertise and clinical intuition or experience, the best available evidence, and last but not least, taking into consideration patient preferences and values through informed consent, and that means through transparent communication of risk and benefit. But unfortunately, well before the pandemic, evidence-based medicine has become an illusion. It is being hijacked by very powerful vested interests. And ultimately, as a result of this, we have now a pandemic of misinformed doctors and misinformed and unwittingly harmed patients based upon a number of factors. Biased funding of research that's funded because it's likely to be profitable, not beneficial for patients. Biased reporting in medical journals, biased reporting in the media, biased patient pamphlets, defensive medicine, and last but not least, medical curricula that fail to teach doctors how to comprehend and communicate health statistics. So if we start with that bigger picture overview, I came into this particular conversation around the vaccine as someone who did not even conceive of the possibility that a vaccine could cause any specific harm. And I was one of the first to have two of the Pfizer vaccines in January 2021. I even went on Good Morning Britain to try and help tackle vaccine hesitancy amongst high-risk ethnic minority groups in the UK, where there was increased vaccine hesitancy. And then over a period of months, the situation evolved, the situation changed. I think many people, we knew certainly by the summer of 2021 that there wasn't a significant effect on the vaccine preventing even infection and transmission for various reasons. It could be obviously mutated strains. And then I suffered a personal tragedy. My father, who was vice president of the British Medical Association, fit and well, suffered a cardiac arrest at home in July 2021. And his post-mortem findings were inexplicable to me. He had two critical stenosis, narrowings in his coronary arteries, which suggested to me, having known his cardiac history and him being well, that something had happened to accelerate coronary artery disease. Without going into all the details, over a period of several months, I started looking at the evidence and critically appraising it. And where we are now is that we have to try and understand the data in a way that patients can understand, in keeping with the principles of informed consent. And only a few months ago, the UK government released information looking at real-world data with all its caveats, non-randomized data, the benefits of the COVID vaccines, specifically Pfizer vaccines, looking at per 1 million people vaccinated versus per 1 million people unvaccinated. So the benefits are these from that data in absolute terms. If you're 70 years old, and this is during the Omicron strain, 2 doses of the Pfizer vaccine, you have to vaccinate 2,500 people to prevent 1 severe hospitalization. If you're 60 years old, it's 5,700. And when you get into people who are younger, under 50, you're talking about hundreds of thousands of people needing to be vaccinated to prevent 1 severe outcome from COVID. Now, what about the harms? You know, you can look on the internet, you can Google my name around COVID vaccines, and you'll hear these fact checkers saying Dr. Malhotra quotes anecdotes and low quality evidence. I'm going to give you information on the highest quality level of evidence we have in terms of benefits and harms of the vaccine. And that's Pfizer's own and Moderna's own trials that led to not just approval of these vaccines by the regulators, but mandates, coercion. And what those original trials found when they were reanalyzed by independent researchers, Joseph Freeman from Louisiana, ER doctor, data scientist, Robert Kaplan from Stanford, Peter Doshi, associate at the BMJ, was that in the original double-blinded RCT, you were more likely to suffer a serious adverse event from the vaccine, hospitalization, disability, life-changing event, than you were to be hospitalized with COVID. Now, what does that suggest? And I've made this argument, and I'm still going to make this argument again. It is likely that this particular mRNA vaccine should not have been approved for use in a single human. Now, people could argue about high-risk people, and I get that maybe the benefits overall, the evidence suggests they outweigh the harms. But that really becomes irrelevant when you've got a serious adverse event rate of at least 1 in 800. We have pulled other vaccines for much less. 1976, the swine flu vaccine was suspended because it was found to cause Guillain-Barré syndrome in 1 in 100,000 people. 1999, rotavirus vaccine was pulled because it was found to cause intussusception, a form of bowel obstruction in children, in 1 in 10,000. We are talking with high quality evidence of an adverse event rate which is serious of at least 1 in 800. This is a no-brainer. And what's most disturbing is when one reflects on it now, you know, we realize all these structural failures that have existed for a very, very long time because of both visible and invisible unchecked power of big, powerful corporations who people need to fully understand are there for the primary legal purpose to provide profit for their shareholders, not to give you the best treatment. And often, as legal entities, as described by forensic psychologist Dr. Robert Hare, who is behind the original international DSM criteria for psychopathy, he describes them enacting in psychopathic ways. So I've come up with a new term that Richard Horton referenced in The Lancet when he came to my talk in London, called the psychopathic determinants of health, which is really a derivation from the commercial determinants of health, which is strategies and approaches adopted by the private sector to promote products and choices that are detrimental to health. So this is really the end result of these big system failures. And we now have to find solutions and wind back from those harms. And that's hopefully what we need to continue doing as we move forward, because otherwise this situation, I promise you, will only get worse. We are here because of undemocratic, unscientific, and unethical laws. And if we're going to wind back from those harms, it means changing the laws so that the government is able to protect the public from the excesses and manipulations of the pharmaceutical industry. Thank you.
Awesome. So, Asim, when I'm hearing you talk about, the data is out there. We've got the evidence for the harms, but also, the waning efficacy. Why do you think, as a society and as well as our medical profession, that we are here? Like, are you, I mean, you can't be the only one. This group cannot be the only people who are seeing this. What do you think is the reason why we are not able to see this?
It's a great question, Kim. So the real battle we've got here is not an intellectual one in terms of getting to the truth. The science is very clear, not just from the RCT reanalysis. You look at pharmacovigilance data. I know Martin will talk more about that later. You look at high quality observational data. You look at, you've got plausible biological mechanism of harm. You've got autopsy data. You've got clinical data. I've never seen in my whole life, in my whole career as a doctor, over 20 years, I've never been aware of a pharmacological intervention that has such poor efficacy and such unprecedented harms. I've never seen anything like it. So why is this not common knowledge? And the first thing I will say is that this is not an intellectual barrier that we're having to overcome. This is a psychological one. So let's go back a little bit to a few years ago. Only about several weeks ago, the front page of the Daily Telegraph in the UK had a headline, which was leaked WhatsApp messages involving our Secretary for Health, Matt Hancock. And the headline was this: we must frighten the pants off the public in relation to COVID. Now, what does that mean? Well, it meant that people were deliberately, to some degree, put under feelings of excess fear. So all of us at some stage were probably in a similar situation. I still remember at the beginning, we didn't know what we were dealing with. And what happens when you're under a state of fear is two things. One is it inhibits your ability to engage in critical thinking. And there's still some of that, remnants of that fear existing today. But also what it means is, from a population perspective, it means the government are able to have greater control on the population. The second issue is something called willful blindness. And that's when human beings turn a blind eye to the truth in order to feel safe, avoid conflict, reduce anxiety, and to protect their prestige and fragile egos. And that's the other major big barrier we're dealing with. And this is something we're all capable of in different circumstances. And until we face this head on and understand that, then we won't be able to make as much progress as we could or we should in terms of disseminating the truth to the public and to policymakers as well. Many of them are in the same position. So that's really the barriers we have to overcome first, because the evidence from my perspective, and I think many people, is very, very clear that this, at the very least, there should be a pause. There should be an acknowledgement that there is considerable harm, and then there needs to be an investigation. And then we need to provide solutions as we move forward in terms of, removing conflicts of interest when it comes to medical decision-making and health policy. And unfortunately, there is a cultural issue as well. A broader topic, but an important one to understand, is that we have got to this position with these big, powerful corporations having so much power over our lives because of a neoliberal economic policies adopted by Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher in the 1980s. I don't think it was deliberately, but this is what's happened. And once we understand those, then we can then try and change the system that actually works for the interests of the people, not for a privileged few that essentially profit from lying. And that's what we've got. We haven't got a free market anymore. We've got a freedom to deceive market.
I like it. All right. Well, Asim, we wish you were here on our panel so we could continue the dialogue with you. However, we're going to have to say goodbye to you. And
thank you.
Thank you. We're like, thank you. It was awesome. Well, that was great. I wish he was up here and this was the Fifth Street. But anyways, so obviously he set up some general, like the data's there. We've got, and I like how he actually framed it at the end, like the fear, right? The fear. And so I want to just kind of go really wind back to the beginning. And this is a question for you, Martin. And just so you guys know what we're going to do, it's going to be like popcorn. I like popcorn. I like popcorn conversations because we're going to throw out a lot of different topics, and it's going to be, and hopefully when you leave, you're going to have a lot of ideas that have come through. So just know that that is the way we're going to do it. We're going to just be flopping around. So, Martin, as someone who studies epidemiology and has a special interest in infectious diseases, what was your mindset at the start of the pandemic? And with the unknowns, the daily reports of deaths, every day we had Cuomo coming in telling us what was happening in New York. We had the ticker tape of how many cases were happening around the world of the virus. Well, how did you think about it? And what were some of the concerns and questions you had?
Well, in terms of fear, I was afraid for about 10 minutes. So when we had the outbreak started in Wuhan, but then we got the big outbreaks in northern Italy and Iran as the first two countries outside of China. And when that happened, it was crystal clear to me as somebody who understands reasonably well infectious disease immunology that this was going to spread to the whole world. There was absolutely no way to prevent that. It will reach every part of the world sooner or later. At the time, we didn't know how serious it was, what the fatality was. But I looked, during those 10 minutes, I looked at the data from Wuhan and looked at the age of the people who died. And at that time, you would expect that people in Wuhan would be about equally exposed because there was no protections. Maybe the older people were slightly less exposed because maybe they sit home more. But you wouldn't expect the exposure to be very different by age. But the mortality was very, very different by age. It was older people, mostly, who died from COVID in their 70s and 80s. And then it went gradually down. So I did a calculation on the back of the envelope, and I realized that this was more than but anybody can get the infection, which is you would expect, but it's more than 1,000-fold difference in risk of mortality. So I have 3 children. As any parent, I care more about my children than myself. So at this point, it was clear to me that my kids were not at risk for this. Older people, yes, but my kids were not at risk. So then I figured, okay, fine, they'll be fine, we'll all be fine. And I think this thing that was actually known from the very beginning, that this was the 1,000-fold difference in mortality risk, that's something that we forgot about in public health. Both when it comes to lockdowns and vaccines, etc. Because what's natural then, what's obvious then, was the fundamental principle of public health is that you protect those that are at high risk. You can't protect everybody. That's impossible. It's going to spread. So you protect those that are high risk. And you let young people live their lives, and you let children go to schools, etc.
So is that kind of the basis for the Great Barrington Declaration? Was that kind of the foundation, like age stratification, natural immunity, let's protect the most vulnerable? Could you just give us a little bit of that? And then I want to go into natural immunity, which I know Todd will have something to say about that.
So that's correct. That's the basis. If it was some other group who were at high risk, that's the group we would have protected instead. For example, in the 1918 flu pandemic, older people were actually less at risk than some younger people. So that is the basis of focused protection, which is the basics of the Great Barrington Declaration. That we didn't do good, we did a lousy job protecting older high-risk people. Not just in New York State, where they sent them sick people to nursing homes to basically infect and kill other nursing home residents, which was criminal, I think. But there were other things that we could have done for older people. You still had cab drivers who were 70-year-olds or 65 were driving in the cab, and that's not a good thing to do. So we could have protected them better. I saw old people in the supermarket. We could have protected them better, and so on. So we were protecting the young adults who of the laptop class who can work from home. That includes me. Who who didn't need, like people in the 20s or 30s, journalists, bankers, lawyers, scientists, and so on, who were at very, very low risk, while older people in the working class were put at risk. So we were protecting laptop class people with low risk, while putting working class people and middle class people in high risk at risk. Because of that, a lot of people died unnecessarily. So not only do I think that our response to the pandemic is the biggest public health fiasco ever in history, it was also, I think, the worst attack on working class and middle class people since segregation and the Vietnam War.
Thanks. So now I want to talk a little bit about natural immunity. Obviously we didn't hear a lot about that. It became all of a sudden the vaccine was going to be the way out. So I know, Todd, you got COVID in early 2020 and had antibodies to prove it because you had to keep doing tests. And then the George Mason mandates came. So what did you do, and tell us why you did it, and what was the outcome? Because I know you worked with some of the people that were involved in the Great Barrington Declaration.
Yeah, so I was an early adopter of COVID. I happened to be in New York City for a conference the last weekend of February 2020, when it was just kind of emerging. I had to wait for a train in Penn Station for a few hours, and I was joking. In retrospect, COVID was probably about the fifth most dangerous thing I was exposed to, with a few hours in Penn Station. But sure enough, a few days after I got home, I had an illness like nothing I'd ever had before. I knew it wasn't the flu, it wasn't a cold, but it was also not what was considered COVID symptoms at the time. I didn't have shortness of breath. I didn't have a fever. I had low temperature. I had terrible night sweats. I had like all these weird things. If you recall, there were no tests at the time, so I couldn't get tested because I didn't have COVID symptoms. And then, of course, a few weeks later, they added everything I had to the list of COVID symptoms, which sort of everything turns out to be COVID symptoms in one way or another. But the good news was I was done, right? It was like, wow, I'm done. Because how did I know that? Because within weeks after this, all the public health authorities, including Anthony Fauci himself, said, if you've got COVID, you're safe, right? Fauci said, I would bet anything that natural immunity will give you long-lasting protection to this virus, like it does for every other similar virus, right? And so I was like, all right, good, I'm done. And so I thought, I'll just be a spectator for the rest of the pandemic, which was, which having it done was actually kind of wild. So it was, and so I was like, all right, I'll play along with the game, right? I'll play along. My daughter got sent home from school. Like Bart was saying, I had to do the mask, do all this sort of stuff. But then the fall came around, and I teach at a uniquely prized law school. I love my law school. I love my colleagues. And we were determined we were going to do our jobs. We were determined we were going to open the law school in the fall. We were going to teach our students in person, especially our first years, and we were going to make it happen if that's what they wanted. And I, was in my 50s, but I said, well, I've had COVID, I think. I hadn't had a test, so I'll go get my antibodies test, right? Got my antibodies test, volunteered, taught in person the entire school year, right? Because I said, I'm safe, right? And, eventually everybody will catch up. The vaccines will come and everybody will catch up. And so I just did my job while a lot of my younger colleagues, went off to their beach houses and, taught remotely and all that sort of thing. And so then the spring came around and, fortunately the vaccines came out for people. People wanted to get it. I was like, all right, good. Well, everything will be normal. And then they start making these noises about vaccine mandates. And I said, well, obviously, I sent a nice polite note. I said, well, obviously, you're going to exempt people with natural immunity, right? Here's study. At this point, we had over a year of data that showed that natural immunity provided robust protection for over a year, right? Basically, they kept extending it. Every 3 months, they would do an update. It's good for 3 months. It's good for 6 months. It's good for 9 months. It's good for a year, right? That basically, we could track this, and it was showing it was providing long-lasting protection. I got some crap response back from the bureaucrats who were designing the system at the university. And this is not a joke. People think that this was a serious enterprise. At my university, the university fire chief was in charge of designing our COVID protocols. That's not a joke, right? Because they thought, oh, this is just an issue of campus safety. So they put in charge the fire chief and the head of lab safety were the ones who are in charge of designing our COVID protocols.
So when did you actually file
Yeah.
the lawsuit? I mean,
Yeah,
because at
so-
some point you had to do a
That's right.
lawsuit that you fought it. And
So I asked them, are you going to do it? They said no. I then sent a demand letter and said, unless you recognize my natural immunity, I'm going to sue you. And they just blew me off. At which point, then I filed the lawsuit. Eventually and I want to thank Professor Koldorf, Martin, Jay Bhattacharya, both filed an expert witness affidavit on my behalf in support of the lawsuit. The university fortunately gave me an exemption a couple weeks later that mooted out my case. So in my case, it had a happy conclusion.
you had a
So,
happy ending, but I also, which is a great thing. But I also know that it was used, or part of the motivation
Yep.
was that it could be used as a kind of model for others.
Yeah, and this
So-
was, I think, a very important point because, I focus specifically on natural immunity. And I had the protection because I taught at a state university that they don't have at places like Dartmouth, which is I had the Constitution on my side. And there were constitutional constraints on what the state as my employer could do to me. But what had happened is there were some lawsuits that had been filed that were well-intentioned, but frankly, kind of amateurish. And I looked at those and I said, we need to have better lawsuits. We need to have a focus specifically on lawsuits we can win to try to roll back the lack of constitutional protections for individual liberty in cases like this. So I looked at it and I said, I'm the right plaintiff. I had these antibodies tests. I knew how to put the case together. I took it to the New Civil Liberties Alliance and Janine Eunice, who I'm sure a lot of you know about, who was my lawyer. And I was able to get experts on my side. But the idea was not just to protect myself, which maybe I could have gotten with just a nice private little request for an exemption. But I wanted to galvanize more of these cases, and I wanted to help sort of ordinary lawyers and ordinary people who weren't law professors think about how you design a case like this that might actually be a winnable case. And so I just kind of felt like I had a responsibility, right? I'm a tenured law professor. I could have lost my job, obviously, which would have been terrible.
I love that you
But,
just said you had the responsibility. So, because I think it started there, but I
Right.
think the idea that as a professor, you were maybe the perfect person to actually set this up for others. And I know
Right.
tonight we're going to hear from Aaron Seary, which has also done a lot on the mandates, but natural
right.
immunity. I want to shift the gear a little bit to safe and effective. I don't know about you, but safe and effective. When I start looking at the media, everybody from Hollywood was telling me and us that the vaccines were completely safe and effective as they're getting the jab on TV. So everybody was saying at the FDA, the CDC, our health systems, our government, everybody, trust the science. Brooke, as a clinical investigator, what does the phrase, in your world, safe and effective? And, I know that you were in this role at Ventavia for a short time, but you saw things that maybe the average person, and certainly not Richard Branson telling me it's safe and effective, that you saw some things inside. So I'd love to hear a little bit about what you saw at Ventavia, and as well as your reporting to the FDA, et cetera.
Thank you, Kim. To answer your question, what is safe and effective? I don't know the answer to that anymore. I know what it looked like for me 3 years ago in conducting clinical trials the right way. I don't know that the FDA and our regulators themselves know what safe and effective looks like anymore. So that's a great question. I don't know how to answer it, but I can tell you from a person that's done clinical research for 20 years, when I started working in Pfizer's clinical trial in September of 2020, it was unlike anything I'd ever seen before. And again, I've been doing this for 2 decades, been overseeing large scale clinical trials, fast enrolling. That was really what I saw and I thought was at the time the problem with this clinical trial was the speed in which it was having to move forward. From the moment I walked into this clinical trial site where we were actually seeing way more patients than we were even able to, get in and out of our doors in a day. I mean, we were pushing through 40, 50, 60 patients a day where we should have been less than half of that. Was a lack of informed consent. That was the first thing that I saw that really kind of made me and gave me pause, was a lack of informed consent where patients should have been given an opportunity to go through these informed consent forms. And whatever time it took them to go through that, they were really just rushed through. So lack of informed consent, a fabrication and falsification of data, a mixing up of lab specimens from one patient to the next. They were just mishandling every aspect of this clinical trial. And so when I took that to my company and said, hey, this is not the right way. This is what we're doing wrong. Here's how we need to make it better. Here's what Pfizer's protocol says. This is what we should be doing and reporting to the regulators and to the FDA. They didn't want to hear me. And so I thought, okay, I have to take this to Pfizer. And while I did that, I did it anonymously. They were kind of the same mindset. We need more patients. Let's start enrolling more. We need more. And finally, I just had a conversation with my husband. It wasn't a matter of, should I do this or not? I felt, although I'm not a medical doctor, I had an ethical responsibility. The data meant something to me, the integrity behind it. It took me a lot longer than 10 minutes to figure out that there really wasn't a problem, more like 10 months for me. But when I made the call to the FDA, I thought certainly that they were going to just sweep in and take care of the problem, and at least, at minimum, not use the data that was collected from these clinical trial sites to support their safety and efficacy analysis. And I lost my job about 6 hours later, which was fine. I knew, based on my experience, my education, I was going to be able to find another job. I wanted to stay in research, but it took me a long time to a year. We were just talking about that, to find another job. No big deal. But really, when I realized that the data from these clinical trials from my sites, where I knew it was all wrong, had been used to support this analysis and used to get their first approval that was given in December, I thought, the FDA didn't do anything. Now I need to take this to the Department of Justice. Surely they're gonna do something about this. So I filed a False Claims Act case, which remained under seal for a little over a year. But still, 10 minutes, 10 months. And for me, what it took was sitting in front of a panel very similar to this and meeting people face to face who were vaccine injured. Not just Pfizer, not just Moderna, but AstraZeneca. I've been a researcher for as long as I have, and I knew adverse events existed, right? Deaths occur. But I was so, removed from it. It really took me meeting people like Bree Dressen and Joel face to face and hearing their stories. And it changed my life. I met Kim the same day. So this is really kind of really going
A homecoming.
Yeah, if you will.
Well, I was going to say thank you, because I know that a lot of times data, there's people who look at data, but it doesn't, equate to the people who've been injured, right? Like they're separate because you're doing a job. So again, I heard something, you did the right thing. So I'm going to applaud on that one.
Thank you.
So you mentioned something, and if Aaron Siri was here right now, I'd want to know. But the power of lawsuits. I always say the power of to really get inside the hood, what's going on. So he was able with that FOIA to get the data that Pfizer wanted for 75, or the FDA wanted 75, 95, whatever years to actually bring it forward. So that right there should tell or be a red flag for everybody to want to wonder why they wanted the data kept secret. So I want to turn to the doctors on the panel. You guys are did you guys ever learn how the FDA works? Did you, in med school, do you learn what safe and effective means? Like, do you learn this system?
I can start, but I'd like to take a step back and thank all the organizers for holding this event, especially Joni. I'd also like to thank Dartmouth for having us and being able to have this dialogue. All I ask is never implement another vaccine mandate again. But to answer your question, I didn't go to Dartmouth, but I did go to medical school. And I can think back. My nutrition class was 2 weeks long. The education I ever received about vaccines was zero. The education I received about the FDA approval process was zero. So for you that think that your doctors are an educated source for that information, they're clearly not. And again, there just was no education about it. I mean, really, there was no education about vaccines. There was no education about the FDA approval process. And I admit, I mean, I was part of the hamster wheel and trusted, for the most part, the health organizations and the federal agencies that I listened to my entire life until I woke up.
So you were one that learned the hard way, but you didn't. So I think there's an assumption. And now, Sandy, I'd be curious, you know, in your med school at Harvard, did you learn about the FDA, how it works? What does safe and effective mean?
Well, to be honest with you, it was so long ago, I hardly remember. I mean, I went to school from 67 to 71. And honestly, I don't remember. We had maybe a morning which would consist of 2 periods of instruction on vaccines, but you have to take into account that there were many fewer vaccines on the schedule when I was in school and when I was a parent than there are now. Maybe we can get to this later, but the schedule exploded after they removed liability from the drug companies and the healthcare professionals administering the vaccines. So it was open season. The vaccine schedule tripled or more almost overnight. I think the Vaccine Act was Child Vaccine Injury Program Act was enacted in 1986 by Ronald Reagan, and I think he was a little reluctant to do that, but he was pressured because the CDC, the drug companies were threatening to not make any vaccines anymore. And the CDC, as you may know, is a quasi-military organization. That's why they wear uniforms. That's why they have a Surgeon General, not just a whatever title, non-military title. And so they kind of blackmailed the government into saying that they would produce vaccines in case of a biological attack, and otherwise, as long as they were granted full immunity from liability. And when they got that, then the vaccine schedule, as I said, exploded.
But you didn't learn about that because obviously you went to school before, but Joel, I mean, I hear this all the time that people and many doctors aren't even aware of the vaccine when that 1986 law came in. So again, it kind of shows us that, you know, this idea of trust as the general public, safe and effective. And so that to me, I was an aha when we found out doctors didn't know. So Martin, you, like, I know when you did the Great Barrington Declaration, you know, obviously vaccines were not there, but what is your opinion of, like, you know, the vaccine wasn't out there at the time you wrote it, and this idea of one size fits all, completely safe and effective. I'm curious through your lens of the Great Barrington Declaration.
So I think a key thing when we look at the vaccine and vaccine mandates is still this more than 1,000-fold difference in risk of dying from COVID. Uh, the randomized trials showed a 95% efficacy against symptomatic disease for a few months. Now, maybe I'm heartless, but I don't really care about if you have sniffles for a few days and are in bed. What I care about is that you don't die. So the trial should have used death as the primary outcome. No, they didn't. And it could easily have done so by recruiting more older people to the trial. The majority of people recruited to trials were young and middle-aged, and they survived whether they got the vaccine or not. So the trials didn't answer the important question of mortality, nor did it answer the secondary questions of hospitalization or transmission, which are also important to know. But symptomatic disease is not the important outcome. So if we look at the vaccine now, well, when the vaccine came out, we don't know about all the risks because with any drug or any vaccines, there can be adverse reactions. We don't know, there are tests during the trial, but not that many people get it, so we don't know the full picture. For example, we now know that there's myocarditis and adverse reactions to the mRNA vaccines. We didn't know that at the beginning, and it was impossible to know that. That's just the nature of things. We still have to go forward and develop drugs and vaccines without that full knowledge. But we didn't know it at the time. But how do we then look at these vaccines? Well, if you're 84 years old, your risk of dying from COVID is quite high. So even if there's a small risk of an adverse reaction from the vaccine, that's acceptable because the benefits outweigh the risks. Now, if you're 24 years old, your risk of dying from COVID is minuscule. So even if the risk is very small from an adverse reaction, it's not worth taking the vaccine. So we have to look at this age gradient in mortality when we look at how do we deal with these vaccines. The other thing is natural immunity. Todd didn't need the vaccines because he had immunity already. And we have known about that if you have an infections, you get immunity. We've known about that for about 2,500 years since the Athenian plague in 430 BC, until 3 years ago when we didn't know about it. And then now we're starting to know about it again. So there's no reasons for somebody who had COVID to get the vaccines. And if you believe that these are important vaccines for older people, high-risk people, which I do, I think it saved lives of older high-risk people in 2020, then you don't want to waste a shortage of supplies of vaccines for people who don't need it. The same thing with lower-risk students at Dartmouth and other places.
So then
They're not the one we should give the vaccines to. And in fact, you can argue that by doing these mandates for colleges, they were forced to give the vaccines that were in short supply to college students at very, very low risk, while older people in, let's say, Brazil or India or Nigeria didn't get it. So these mandates of universities in the US actually killed people in the developing world who didn't get it. So this age gradient, I think, is sort of fundamental to understand both the lockdowns as well as the vaccines.
Yeah, thank you. I think it goes back to that risk benefit and safety. And one thing, with the safety, you would think they would be interested in investigating these safety harms that are emerging with young people. You would think that somebody at the FDA would be interested. And VAERS, did you learn about VAERS? Do you know if the hospitals or if the clinics, did they get training on how VAERS and how to report systems? Because it doesn't seem like there was much interest when you look at all of these, or we should have done a recap, like if there's sudden deaths with young people, we should be curious. And I'm curious if anybody has any thoughts on the way we looked at safety issues.
So the VAERS system is actually quite a bad system for evaluating vaccine safety for two reasons. One is there is underreporting, it's spontaneous reports, and there's also overreporting, because people will have some adverse reaction to something that's unrelated to the vaccine, but it can still be reported. So we don't necessarily know an individual if it's due to the vaccine or not, but there's also things that happen that's not reported. So we don't have proper denominators. There's some ways to try to get around that, but it's not a good system. So the US has two systems that are much, much better. One is the CDC together with health plans, including Kaiser's, run the Vaccine Safety Data Link, where they looked at electronic health records. You know exactly who got the vaccine, and then you know all the things that happened to them afterwards. So you can compare those who got the vaccine with those who didn't get the vaccine. And for example, if we look at their data, we know that for young male adults, there's about a 1 in 3,000 risk of myocarditis, or clinically manifested myocarditis.
But can I ask you a question? Do you think they are curious? So I go back to, is there a curiosity, like you as a researcher, but like Joel, you've spent a lot of time in the VAERS system, you work in the with the injured. Is there a curiosity around safety from our federal government?
I'm sorry to interrupt, but I'm curious because just recently I was listening to a report by Jessica Rose, and there are 1.5, I wrote it down, 1.5 million adverse event reports currently in VAERS right now on 4 products, 4 different COVID-19 products, compared to all the vaccines prior over the last 30 years where there were 39,000. So something is obviously going on.
And I know the VAERS is also what you always hear. It's never good enough, but it's what we have, so it should be something. So Joel.
Yeah, I'd just like to start again. I'm not real proud of my education, but prior to my vaccine injury, I had never heard of VAERS. So as probably all of you know, VAERS is the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System. It's a horrible system, but who created it? The FDA and the CDC. And I'm going to quote from a letter dated 4/18 of 2023, just several days ago, from Peter Marks to Linda Westella, who submitted a letter requesting several things be added to the package insert. And this is from Peter Marks himself. VAERS is a national passive surveillance vaccine safety database that receives unconfirmed reports of possible adverse events following the use of vaccine, and I'll go on and on. Okay. So basically, he's criticizing his own system. It's a passive surveillance system, meaning I call it a symptom repository. Okay. Meaning people just say their symptoms. They don't do anything really about them to objectify it and make an objective database, but they rely on this symptom repository to look for safety signals. Isn't that ironic? So I always say, if you want to turn VAERS into an objective database, you got to do 3 things. Number 1, you have to communicate that reporting is mandatory. It is mandatory. As a physician, I didn't know that, but it is mandatory. Number 2, okay, you have to provide a stick. You have to provide a penalty that if practitioners don't report. And number 3, you have to have follow-up. Unconfirmed reports. Remember all those contact tracers that we had hired that did nothing early on? Okay, hire them all back. Okay, hire them all back. Have them follow up. Okay, and therefore it's not passive, it's not unconfirmed, and it's not possible. You make it a real objective database. But clearly, if you don't do those things, you don't want to know. And that's what I say to Peter Marks.
Sandy.
In defense of VAERS, speaking as a clinician, I think it's been a very valuable tool. And a couple of comments about if someone submits a report, it goes through a committee that has to decide whether maybe this is related to vaccines. It's not just a random report that shows up in the records. And also VAERS had to hire a huge team of people to keep up with the reports that were coming in. There were so many. Another thing that most people should know is that I know there's this one physician in Ohio who queried 200 emergency rooms and asked them what VAERS was. They had never heard of it. And of course, now this should be the first question anyone asks when somebody comes into the emergency room. So, and in my local hospital, with the same, a very small, like 200 bed hospital, 150 bed hospital, nobody knew about VAERS, nobody. And when you look at the VAERS reports from just COVID alone, in almost every category, deaths, the number of reports dwarf the total of the reports from the last 30 years in the childhood schedule, which is where a lot of the reports showed up. I mean, dwarfed by hundreds of percent and more. And the other thing to consider is that when the CDC explored this problem of under and over reporting, they found that 1% or less of the reports are ever made. So you can multiply by 100, or in this instance with COVID, because the injuries are probably reported more often, particularly if they're serious, now that more people know about it, the factor has been multiply it by 10 times or whatever. Anyway, it's underreporting is the big problem with VAERS. It's not overreporting.
Yep.
So
I was going to say, I always think that's a great place for somebody who wants to do advocacy. Get out and educate your doctors and make them, or see if there's a way. I don't know.
Can I say one thing, Kim?
Yeah.
You know, a lot of people say it's rare, and even some politicians have said it's rare, and they say it's 1 in a million. You know, at React 19, we represent, I mean, over 30,000 Americans injured by the shots. If it's 1 in a million, we represent just a couple more than 350.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks for keeping it real too, being the, I want to turn to something that I heard a couple of you say, informed consent. I know, Brooke, you said it in trials. You know, we've got Sandy, who was a founding partner of Physicians for Informed Consent. You've been advocating for a long time, Sandy, for decades. In your opinion, like, what does true informed consent look like? And then and what elements should be a part of it? Then I'm going to go to the ones, Joel, specifically, because you had the shot. I'd like for you to talk a little bit about, did you have informed consent? So I'd love for you guys on the panel to just talk about informed consent as well, even legally. So
I can start if you want. So informed consent really understands that you have risk benefits. You understand the risk benefits and options when you're considering any drug or intervention. And certainly, you know, I am an orthopedic surgeon. I did about 800 to 900 surgical procedures on people per year. So I did thousands of joint replacements on people. And I certainly understood from that perspective what risk benefits and options were. And I certainly had a conversation with each person that I operate on. In the standpoint of the shots, it's a little bit more complicated. You know, to understand risks, you have to have true and transparent data. And you have to understand the data that was available at the time when it was known. And I still think we don't know all of that, of what people knew when. But I hope through probably the courts that in process of discovery that information will come out. But you really have to understand the risks, benefits. You know, obviously, that I think is pretty clear. And the options, I think in the COVID shots, it comes into when you think about options, it has to do with understanding natural immunity and having that discussion. In my situation, I can tell you on December 30th of 2020, my number came up in the 1A group. If you remember, that was the healthcare workers. I got an email, said, go make your appointment. I did, I showed up. I said my name. The nurse said, sit down. And I pulled out my arm from my shirt. And within 15 seconds, I had my shot. There was no words said. She said, go sit over there. I sat over there, and I kind of knew to make sure I didn't have anaphylaxis. She said, after 20 minutes, you can leave. I said, okay. That's what I did. There was no conversation. I signed nothing. We had no discussion. And I'll be honest with you, I'm realistic. I understand that with any intervention, there's risks. And I totally get that. You know, I've operated on people where they were otherwise healthy and they've had some horrible outcomes, even death. And, you know, I certainly understand there's risks. But there, for me at least, there was nothing. And if I tell you one thing, what I've learned is if you would have told me one thing, I will say honestly that I wouldn't have done it, which was, from a liability standpoint, if you're injured, you're on your own. Okay. And if it's your child that gets injured, you're on your own. Okay. And I think if that's one thing, if somebody would have that conversation and I would have understood about legal immunity and that I was on my own, if I would have had that one conversation, I would have walked. Now it's hindsight's 2020 and I totally get it. But you have to have these conversations. And I think this vaccine particularly is a little bit more complicated because of all the immunity that's given. You have no recourse if you're injured.
I wonder, I was going to say, I wonder if that is that or should that be part of informed consent? You know, I know I've heard people say it's, you know, that's not really medical, but it is if you're left and you're harmed. So, Sandy, what's your thought on informed? It's somebody who's kind of the father of informed consent. Is like the elements of informed consent and what was missing? Should somebody know that they're on their own if somebody gets harmed?
Well, just to answer yes, that's pretty straightforward. I do think it's part of, I mean, medical risk isn't confined to medicine. There's all kinds of, as we know from the lockdowns, there's all other kinds of things that can affect health. And the lockdowns did that in spades. So if you impoverish a family and add family stress of all different kinds, if there's a sick child or a sick parent, it affects health.
Yeah, I would say
Period.
the principle to me would be, what would a reasonable person want to know? For me, I mean, I got nothing. Zero discussion. But
So in the hospital, as you know, there is pretty good informed consent protections. If you're going to operate on somebody,
Sure.
They have to sign a paper and so forth. In the office, it's very vague. And there's, in Vermont, the statute, there's one statute about informed consent, and it's really to protect the doctors. And the standard that they use for giving it is any reasonable practice is. So if it's not reasonable to give informed consent if you're going to prescribe penicillin for somebody with a minor infection. Most people don't. They just take their doctor's word for it. But it was something like an experimental product that has no safety record whatsoever and is a brand new technology that's never been rolled out on humans. Furthermore, being rolled out on a global scale, not just in your hometown, then informed consent becomes really important.
Yeah, I was going to say, I've heard so many people who have gotten these shots. Like I met somebody on the plane yesterday who they were trying to do it at Red Rock concert in Colorado. And so we've seen people, bars, things that there's no possible way that informed consent was even a part of those decisions. So that is the world that we are living in. So thank you. And I'm really sorry. I want to turn to another conversation, censorship. You know, the divisive word term anti-vaxxer, anti-science, conspiracy theorist has been a huge problem in society and driving a wedge. And it became political. It's torn families, friends, groups. Good people have been smeared, personal and professional reputations destroyed, and in some cases, careers lost. So everybody, you know, from the media, social media, censorship, I'd love to hear from you guys some of your experiences with censorship. I've got specific questions if you want, but I'd love to just, you know, hear your thoughts on censorship, and then we'll go into your cases. Anybody? Popcorn.
Okay, I'll go. I only because I've had a personal experience with it. a strange patient that I've never known and probably never will submitted a complaint to my medical board, and which earned me an investigation from the medical board, and no action was taken, thankfully. But I got a stern warning in the letter that any deviation from scientific consensus at that time was determined according to our medical board by the current public health messaging, which we all know about, safe and effective. If you deviate from that, it's considered unprofessional conduct, and you can have your license suspended or revoked. And Earl Nass is here. She knows that firsthand, and thank goodness she is, with the help of... It's not something that the average physician like myself could pursue, but with the help of Children's Self-Defense and Robert F. Kennedy's group, that's being pursued, and I know they tangled with the wrong person, and I think they will succeed in this suit. I hope they do.
So I've had, I did a number of, I was on TV a lot talking about my lawsuit. I gave presentations and that sort of thing. I remember I went on the Bill Walton podcast. I've been on a couple times, and within days that was taken down off of YouTube. I've had other things removed from YouTube, and all I've ever done is present the data on natural immunity versus vaccine protection against infection and transmission. And there's not like there's any doubt about this, right? We're talking about like hundreds of studies done around the world, and not a single one of these hundreds of studies has shown that vaccines are better than natural immunity. And they all show that natural immunity is better than vaccines after a short period of time, and certainly better than some of the lesser vaccines. So it's not like there's any doubt about the science yet. But what's kind of stunning about this is these things will just disappear. They'll just say violates YouTube's terms of service, but they'll never explain how, why, and anything like that, right? It just disappears. And, and this is a really important issue, because one of the things that really changed this for me was Twitter, which is when I was trying to figure out whether I should get vaccinated after I had natural immunity, which is a fascinating story in itself. I recovered from a terrible case of shingles, Ramsay-Hunt syndrome, that I had acquired. And I was about to get the shingles vaccine. And my doctor looks at me like thinking to himself, how could somebody as stupid as you possibly be a law professor? And I'm looking at him like, why are you looking at me like that? And he says, it's like, you don't get vaccinated against the virus right after you've recovered from the virus, unspoken, you moron, because you don't need it. And because because it risks reinflaming the virus, right? He brings me around, shows me my herpes zoster antibodies. He says, come back in a year or something, and we'll determine whether or not we want to talk about the shingles vaccine. And I walk out of the office and I say to myself, wait, isn't SARS-CoV-2 also a virus? And I discovered this doctor, Human Norchasm, on Twitter, who was tweeting up the storm about this, and hadn't gotten shut down at that point. He'd had a bunch of complaints filed against him for this. But fortunately, I found him, and he ended up sort of explaining all this to me and that sort of thing. But the bottom line here, Kim, is the public health community thinks we are idiots. They think we are children. They have always thought we are children, right? And we can't handle the truth is basically their view. And so they can't allow any dissent. And the idea of informed consent is just not part of their culture. And I say that having studied this, right? What we see today is the direct extension of what we saw in the 20th century, which was compulsory sterilization techniques of people who are deemed to be, quote, feeble-minded, right? And the Supreme Court upheld that. Yep. Oliver Wendell Holmes saying 3 generations of imbeciles is enough. A law that is sufficient to allow you to prevent, to force vaccination is certainly broad enough to allow the forcible tying of your fallopian tubes, citing the famous vaccine case, Jacobson versus Massachusetts, right? And they sterilized tens of thousands of people in the 20th century,
Okay.
did without their consent.
Yeah, I
And
was going to
that's where it goes
say,
back.
I know that's one. And then, but going back to censorship, Joel, like, because I think you have a very interesting because of the injured. And I want you to talk a little bit of what's happening in censorship around the people
Yeah.
of your community.
And thank you, Kim. So censorship, what I would tell you is, as a scientist, censorship is really impeded science. There's few things in science that are absolute. And, again, we made a hypothesis, when we came in this pandemic, and we certainly had a lot of hope that we wanted the pandemic to be over. We wanted the vaccine to work. Who didn't want it to be over sooner? So the reality, though, is it didn't work as promised, and we ignored the truth and really never admitted we were wrong, and then, frankly, doubled down. And if you look at the Twitter files, for example, you'll see the obvious example of, really right there, black and white, said, censor even true stories of vaccine injured because it might go against the current narrative. The other way censorship, I think, really hurts is it promotes tyranny and it inhibits individual liberty. It's sad, and it's sad. Again, young people really have to understand what this type of censorship will lead to, in our own freedoms. But I want to give you two other stories. One is in React 19, we held an event. It was very amazing. It was at the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. That's really right where Martin Luther King and a lot of classic, big speeches were given. And we made a brand new video called Silence, which is all about censorship. It was written by a wonderful songwriter who's vaccine injured, sung by a professional singer who was also vaccine injured, again, called Silence. And it was taken down within 8 hours. You can't make this stuff up.
Crazy.
I'm going to tell you one other story quickly. So about my prior employer. So for 10 years at my practice, I was independent. For 10 years, I was employed. And I was on extended medical leave for almost 2 years. And I know they weren't very proud of me for kind of speaking up, and it certainly got around. And I was literally gone, not working on extended medical leave for 18 months when I got investigated for prescribing irregularities. And they basically gave me a threat that they would report me to the medical board. I hadn't worked for 18 months. This is the kind of stuff you can't make up. And nothing surprises me anymore. But the censorship really has prevented us from having a dialogue. And again, we're so polarized now, Democrats and Republicans, independent. I don't care. The truth of the matter is we have to start caring for each other. And it's really more of a humanitarian call of a mission rather than a political mission. And that's
Amen.
So, thank you. So with the censorship, though, we're prevented from having that basic dialogue, which is unfortunate, and it's missing.
Yeah, I was going to say, Martin, I heard that you were kicked off the CDC Vaccine Safety Council, and I'd like to just, that idea of being kicked off something professionally and what it does to your peers.
Yeah, so censorship is something that exists in left-wing and right-wing dictatorships, but not in the United States, is what I thought 3 years ago. I have been censored by YouTube, Twitter, LinkedIn, and Facebook for accurate public health information. For example, I posted a link to an article that I wrote with Jay Bhattacharya in Newsweek titled How Fauci Fooled America, and LinkedIn didn't like that, so they took it off. We did a roundtable with Governor Ron DeSantis in March of 2021, where we, among other things, argue that there should be no vaccine passports or mandates, and we shouldn't mask children. YouTube didn't like that, so they removed it. I was censored and also suspended for about 3 or 4 weeks from Twitter. One of the things was that I argued that people with natural immunity or children doesn't need the COVID vaccine. They didn't like that. As Kim mentioned, I was also, this is not really censoring, but I was fired by CDC because I was serving on the COVID-19 vaccine safety committee, safety working group. And in the spring of 2021, I was fired from that committee. Now, you would think that I was probably fired because I was saying something anti-vaccines. Is that what you think? Well, you're wrong. I'm probably the only one who's been fired by CDC for being too pro-vaccine. So in the spring of 2021, CDC put a pause on the J&J vaccine. There were some reports about blood clotting in women under 50. So it made perfect sense to put a pause on the vaccine for people under 50. But my expertise is in vaccine safety and also the early detection of adverse reactions. So I could see how the data was coming in, and there was no indication that there was a problem for older Americans in the 70s or 80s, and they're the ones who really need these vaccines. Young women don't really need it anyhow. So why take off a vaccine that has the potential of saving older Americans when there's a shortage of vaccines? And they would then either go to the mRNA vaccines or they won't get a vaccine at all because there was a shortage. And this vaccine is a one dose, so it's important for hard to reach people like rural people or people who are maybe homeless or so on. So I argued in an op-ed in The Hill that we shouldn't put a pause on this vaccine for older Americans. And CDC didn't like that. I know that the director of CDC, Rochelle Walensky, was part of the conversation about me being kicked out. And they kicked me out of the committee because of that. So I have been censored for being critical of giving the vaccine to children and those who have had it. I've been kicked out of CDC by thinking that older people should get the vaccine. So I guess it's impossible to make everybody happy or anybody happy, actually. So.
And how about you, Brooke? I mean, obviously, as a whistleblower, you probably have had a lot of different things that you've been censored for, or
It's actually been the opposite. I have not really been censored on many platforms. I would say, the British Medical Journal being censored on Facebook was the biggest, censorship that I dealt with. But they've left me alone on Twitter, and I think that's probably because they tried to use my words against me in court. I've called Anthony Fauci a criminal because I feel like he is one, and that was actually thank you. That was actually my Twitter account. That post was actually admitted as an exhibit in Pfizer's court documents that I called Anthony Fauci a criminal, and I had an anti-vax, anti-government, and was there with an agenda, and I do. I am, and that is to make sure that vaccine injured are given a voice. That has just become my fight. I will no longer work in the pharmaceutical industry again. It's beyond me. But I will never, ever stop fighting for, Joel, people on this panel, Bree Dresden, the people that have been harmed by this product. It's overwhelming, how they do it on a day-to-day basis. I don't know, but it takes courage, and I just thank you both for standing up. I appreciate it.
great. Well, I know we're kind of getting closer, but I want to talk a little bit about mandates. Just the idea of mandates. I would love to hear your thoughts on it. Obviously, the schools, but we've got other schools out there right now that have mandates for the bivalent that is EUA. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on it, and you guys can take over.
Yeah, I'll kick off because we've got a very long and well understood approach towards mandates, which is mandates are justified only if the treatment, or in this case the vaccine, prevents infection and transmission. If all it does is protect the recipient, there's no reason to mandate it, right? Otherwise, you think that we could have mandatory exercise and mandatory broccoli eating, In this case, we could have, a mandatory, gastric surgery, because if you're overweight, you're more prone to serious outcomes, right? And so far, we don't have those mandates, right? So it can only be justified if there is, if it prevents infection and transmission on a community-wide basis, and we all understand that these don't, but a lot of people don't understand why they don't. Now, let me just ask a question. How many people here are familiar with the importance of mucosal immunity when it comes to SARS-CoV-2? Right? So this is an unusually well-informed group, and probably a quarter or a third of you, right? Here's the thing, and if you don't believe me, I would urge you to take a look at an article that was published on January 11th, 2023, by 3 authors, including Anthony S. Fauci, published a week after he left, retired from his current position, where he says SARS-CoV-2 vaccines cannot prevent infection and transmission. Why? Because they don't generate mucosal immunity. The idea of mucosal, and he admits in here, for example, how many people know that in recent years, the flu vaccine has had a vaccine efficacy of about 14%, right? Why is that? Because it turns out these kind of respiratory illnesses, flu and SARS-CoV-2, enter through your nose, right? They enter through your nose and your mouth. That's what we talk about mucosal immunity. These vaccines go in your system, right? They don't create mucosal immunity in your nose where it enters, right? And so what happens is, the idea is eventually it goes in your nose, it percolates for 5 to 7 days, as Anthony Fauci nicely explains. It percolates for 5 or 7 days and finally hits your system, and it's basically then your systemic immunity is primed to respond to keep you from getting serious illness. But it doesn't prevent you from getting sick, and it doesn't prevent you from getting transmitting it, right? We all know the viral load is comparable, and we've known that for a long time, for somebody who is vaccinated to somebody who didn't have any immunity at all. Natural immunity gives you mucosal immunity, so it can be sterilizing, and because it kicks in your immune system so quickly, it heavily protects against serious illness, and it also neutralizes so you don't spread it. It's much less likely to spread it to other people, right? Now, here's the thing. We have known that since before any of these vaccine mandates on college campuses went into effect. We knew that as early as July 2021 from the Israeli data. It's all in my complaint that I filed the first week of August, pointing to all of the evidence was coming out. The CDC knew this. The Washington Post got a hold of a CDC internal slideshow that found, as of May 2021, they already knew that 10% of the deaths were in people who are vaccinated, and they knew that at least 250,000 people a month were already getting breakthrough infections who had been vaccinated, right? This was in July 2021. These mandates didn't go into effect until August. The Israelis are already rolling out booster shots. We were rolling out booster shots in the United States by August. Yet they continued to pretend like this was going to prevent transmission and the infection and transmission. And that under any legal standard, that doesn't pass the test. Under any ethical standard, to force this on healthy 20-year-olds, especially ones who have already recovered from COVID, is just utterly immoral. And then when they doubled down with booster shots, it was even more disgusting.
Yeah. So Joel,
So when,
I was going to say, yeah, you guys just take over. I mean,
so when a university or university president puts a mandate of vaccinations on those who already had COVID, that goes against science. That's denial of science. Science we've known for 2,500 years. That's like claiming. To me, that is as shocking as a university president claiming that the earth is flat rather than round, which we have known for about the same amount of time, about 2,500 years. So that just goes against science. It's just ridiculous. It's mind-boggling. Even those students who haven't had COVID, they had so low risk, so there's no reason to mandate it for them either. But then there's another public health argument against mandates. And that is that public health must be based on trust. You can't have public health unless there's trust. It means that if public health agencies or officials want the public to trust them, they have to also trust the public. And mandates goes against trust. So I don't know if any of you have had a teenager ever in your life, but if you try to force somebody to do something, there can be some resistance to it. So if you want people to get vaccinated, then mandates are the most stupidest things you can do. And we have seen that, for example, I think that the polio vaccine is a very important vaccine for children to get, but because of this COVID thing, there's a lot more hesitancy for good reasons against vaccines, but that effects also have affected other vaccines, including important vaccines like polio.
Joel.
Well, I'll expand this a little bit, and I don't want to disagree with anybody, but I'm against mandates for a different reason. I'm not against mandates because the COVID shots didn't prevent infection transmission. I'm an American, and frankly, I believe in individual liberty. And I don't live in the Soviet Union of 1960s. So I believe people have individual liberty and don't have to live in tyranny. So, and I want to expand a little bit into the college mandates, because that's really why we're here. The college mandates just absolutely make no sense. They're anti-science. It makes no sense. I spent some time out there today just watching all the students and why are we doing this? We're not doing this for ourselves. I don't want self-pity. Robert F. Kennedy Jr., I'm sure, is not running for president because he wants to, nor does Senator Ron Johnson run for his third term because he wants to. We're doing this, and I'm sure you're all not here because you don't have better things to do. We're here because we're in the fight. We're really, truly in the fight for humanity.
Thank you. Sandy.
Geez. So a couple of things. Mandates and informed consent are at opposite poles. And just because a vaccine prevents infection and transmission doesn't justify a mandate of any kind whatsoever. Informed consent was originally, as you probably know, first articulated after the Nazi atrocities in 1947 after World War II. And it was put there when the culture was different than it is today. And it was put there to, as a kind of an absolute guardrail against medical abuse in a similar way that our Constitution and Bill of Rights are there to kick in at particular times when we're having a real lot of problems, which we are now. So I see informed consent as really an absolute and not a relative concept. It's not justifiable in any circumstance whatsoever. And I have a lot more to say about this.
I wish we had time.
Yeah, so I'll just leave
Okay.
it at that for now.
Okay, I was going to say, I just got the warning that we're going to start wrapping it up. So, I have just some final questions. I always hate leaving. I would love to hear what you guys, is there any hope? Like, do you have silver lining? Is there something that you want to let the people in the audience, the students who might be here or online listening, something that you could leave with them? Also, maybe somebody could talk about how do we gain trust again, and leave us with something that we can do actionable. And I'm going to why don't you start, Sandy, down at the end?
Well, they can regain trust by respecting the ethical frameworks that are already in place in our Constitution. We have these rights endowed by our Creator. It's not something they can give and take at their whim. Informed consent is a really important one. And the concept of human freedom, human dignity, and fundamental freedoms runs through all the codes that articulate informed consent. So the intersection of those codes and our constitutional freedoms is very close. So I think, I'll just leave space for other people to.
Thank you.
I'll just say a few words, right? First, I agree with all that. I'm a law professor, and I'm in law and I'm a professor. So let me say two things about each of those. First, on the law side, what needs to happen, but people need, what has come to light here is we have an antiquated, archaic approach to thinking about vaccine mandates. It goes back to this 1905 Jacobson versus Massachusetts case I talked about before, which dealt with the smallpox vaccine, which had been around for 100 years at that point. And then this kind of all went into abeyance, and then it sprung up in the during this period, and they just looked back at that. What they ignored was the exact same term that Jacobson was decided by the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court also decided a case called Lochner versus New York. The details are not important, but what was important about it was a ringing defense of individual liberty. And Jacobson only makes sense in a world, and Jacobson refers to our Constitution and constitutional liberties. And it was clear that they meant those two things would have to be in balance. And essentially what we saw over the next several years, the next decades, through Buck versus Bell, which I referred to earlier, the Korematsu case that many of you may be familiar with, which dealt with the forcible internment of Japanese during World War II, was predicated on Buck versus Bell and predicated on Jacobson. Who are we to doubt the government's need to forcibly intern innocent Japanese citizens? We're just judges. Who cares about, we can't let things like individual liberty and the Constitution get in our way, right? I thought we had rebelled against that. I thought we had said, we don't like forcible internment. We don't just defer to the government when they say people have to be forcibly sterilized. But that's the rationale that sprang up again in these court cases, which is we're going to just defer to the government when they say that this is safe and effective and it's going to do this, that, and the other. And so I think we need a robust, and we need a revitalization and a recognition that we don't want to live in that world. And that's the world they're taking us back to that I thought we had escaped. The second thing I'll say just briefly as a university professor, universities have been in disgrace on this. Universities are supposed to be, this is where it's supposed to go for truth, for serious scientific debate. We've heard about the corruption of the scientific method. What's happened to the journals is just incredible as I followed this litter in the peer-reviewed literature. Obviously, we need a revitalization of the universities. We need universities to become proper universities again and not just propaganda mills, not just forced. What they've become now are just ways of basically forced conformity on the best and brightest of American society to basically teach them to censor and teach them to toe the party line. And so we need more universities that value freedom of speech. Luckily, I'm at one of those. My law school is one of those. But we need a revitalization of universities because that's the beating heart of where this comes from.
I'm going to have to wrap us because we're getting really close because I know we're going to have Robert Kennedy in here. So do I have one couple minutes? Okay, I'd love to just go through hope.
I think there are plenty of reasons to have hope. I think there are hundreds of reasons to have hope. And they're sitting right in front of me right now. In October of 2020, when I wrote the Great Brain Integration with Dr. Jay Bhattacharya at Stanford and Dr. Snehata Gupta at Oxford, we had a conversation. And it was clear to us that we weren't going to be able to sway the politicians, with a few exceptions. It was clear we weren't going to be able to sway the journalists, with a few exceptions. It was clear we weren't going to sway scientists in leadership position like university presidents and so on, with no exceptions. But what was also clear, I think, that is the public. It was the public who was suffering from the lockdowns. It was the public who were living this experience. So that's where we had hope, and that's exactly what happened. It was the public that was convinced by this very common sense, basic principles of public health, who then forced politicians to slowly change and who forced journalists to slowly change. So I have a lot of hope, and I would like to thank all of you.
Yeah, I just want to be, I'll be brief. And I'm not talking about politics. We are the silent majority, people that believe in science, truth, dialogue, and we're up against evil. And I think, and that's the vocal minority. And I think I'm excited because I think this is grassroots. This is all of you here. This is you talking to your friends, family, all the people out there that just don't know, that they're ready to open their eyes. They're ready to uncover their ears. And I really think that it's through love, which is our story, and our care for fellow humanity that will defeat the evil that we're up against.
Bring it on home, and then
I don't
one
know
last
that it
thing.
could get much better than what Joel said, except for I hope we have a new president in 2024.
Thank you so much. Oh, he's going to come in? All right. Oh, we're not going to take a break. He's going to, we got Kennedy coming in, and you guys can come on down, and we'll, if you want to stand up and take a break, stand up, you can. Thank you so much, everybody.
This man needs no introduction, but I will introduce him anyway. We are so honored to have Robert Kennedy Jr. with us today. He is an environmental and public health lawyer, but we all know he is so much, much more. Please welcome Mr. Kennedy.
Thank you, everybody. I was listening to the discussion, and I was very impressed about, 3 years ago, nobody in this country had heard of VAERS. And it was clear that everybody in this room knew what VAERS was and what the problems are with it. And I was interested in the discussion, but I wanted to point out one thing that if you want to understand VAERS, that everybody should know, and that's a study that came out in 2010 called the Lazarus Study. And for many, many years, in VICA, Congress said, okay, we're going to get rid of immunity liability for these vaccines. But we want to know what injuries they're causing. We want to understand what the risk profile of these products is. And so they ordered CDC to develop a system so that we could accurately track the injury rates of the vaccines. CDC came up with VAERS, but from the outset, people were complaining, like high-level people like David Kessler, the esteemed Surgeon General, were saying this system is utterly inadequate. So they knew that from the beginning. In 2010, CDC commissioned another agency called the Agency for Healthcare Research. They gave them $1 million. And they said, we want you to create an automatic system, an automated system that does not rely on voluntary reporting. There's so many reasons that doctors would not report this for many, many reasons. And many of them, as was pointed out here, never even heard of this system. And there's incentive, doctors don't really want to say to the patient, yeah, I gave you this vaccine, this life-saving vaccine, and it cost your child their life or other injuries. So there's a lot of built-in incentives why people wouldn't report it. Everybody knew it didn't work. So the CDC commissioned the Agency for Healthcare Research to develop a machine counting system that would take the medical claims from the HMOs of all of your vaccination records and then all your medical records. So they know what your medical claims are. And you can correlate, if you have all that in a database, you can correlate the vaccines that you received or certain vaccines by doing a cluster analysis with certain injuries for which medical claims were subsequently made, whether it's, insulin syringes or Adderall or, or epilepsy medication or whatever. So you can make that correlation. So the Agency for Healthcare Research took the smallest of the 10 big HMOs, which was Harvard Pilgrim, and they spent 3 years studying their database. They looked at 770,000 patients. Half of them received vaccines and half it didn't. And they used this new algorithm, this cluster analysis algorithm, to determine the level of injuries. And they were very, very successful and very proud of what they did. The injury rate they reported at the end of that was 1.6%. That means that there was an injury in 1 out of every 37 vaccines administered. If you're administering, 72 doses, it means virtually everybody is going to end up with some kind of injury. Serious, and incidentally, that number 1.6 is exactly the same number that is in the Gardasil clinical trial. For Gardasil alone, it's a 1.6 injury rate. 1 out of every 37 girls is getting injury, but serious injuries. For serious injuries, the Lazarus report found serious injuries were that regular injuries were only 0.3% were reported. That means that fewer than 1% are reported. It means that more than 99% are never reported. Not 99%, but more than 99%. And for serious injuries, it was only 1 to 13% were ever recorded, including deaths. So the Lazarus team, which were a team of Harvard physicians and scientists, handed the results of their study to CDC, and they said, and what CDC said, if this thing works, we're going to roll it out to all the HMOs. And they went back and they showed that it worked. Lazarus showed that it worked. And CDC clearly got terrified because they were telling people it's 1 in a million. These guys were saying it's 1 in every 37. So that's a huge difference. And and it has a very unusual line in this study. It's a 2010 study. It said once we handed this in, the CDC officials who commissioned the study were no longer available by phone or any contact. So CDC just went dark because it did not want to know the truth. And this goes to the subject that I really wanted to talk about today, which was the resilience of this orthodoxy. We know there's 1,000, we've known forever what these scientists were just saying is that there was no science behind the college mandates at the outset. We now have, solid proof that they are causing more harms than they're averting. Clearly, that they are killing our children. They're killing our children. And yet 1,000 colleges in this country still have these mandates and aren't enforcing them, including the college the colleges my children go to. So why is that? Why does the original orthodoxy of safe and effective continue to have this resilience, even when all of the science and all the common knowledge is clearly against it? And this is something that I've kind of dealt with since I got dragged kicking and screaming into this controversy, back in 2006. And at that time, some of you know what happened to me is that I was suing, I was representing Waterkeeper, which is the biggest water protection group in the world. And we were suing coal burning power plants. In 2003, FDA published a study that showed that every freshwater fish in America had dangerous levels of mercury in its flesh. And it struck me that we were living now in this kind of science fiction nightmare where my children, the children of every other American, could now no longer engage in the seminal primal activity of American youth, which is to go fishing with their mother or father in the local fishing hole and then come home and safely eat the fish. And most of that mercury was coming from coal burning power plants. So I was suing. We had about 40 lawsuits at that time in the United States and in the provinces of Canada. And I was going around the country talking to groups like this size. And these women started showing up at almost every speech that I gave. And they would occupy the front rows. They would come early, they would leave late, and they would come up to me after the speech and they would say to me, if you're really interested in mercury contamination exposure to children, you need to look at the vaccines. And as it turns out, all of them were the mothers of children who had intellectual disabilities that they believed were caused by the vaccines. And I immediately realized that the medical orthodoxy said that these women were mistaken. And so why did I listen to them? I listened to them because of a couple things in my experience. One is I knew that experts are often wrong. In fact, experts are wrong 50% of the time. How do I know that? Because I've tried by that time hundreds and hundreds of cases, and there were always experts on both sides. And they were saying opposite things. So half the time they were wrong. So that's like flipping a coin. When I tried the Monsanto case, we had Stanford and Harvard physicians and scientists almost completely on the stand on both sides. And, you know, they agreed, the juries ended up agreeing with ours. The other thing is, I had a child who had severe food allergies, and he had 29 emergency room visits by the time he was 2 years old. And he was severely anaphylactic to virtually so many foods. There were fewer foods that he could eat than he was allergic to. My wife had the ability to know immediately when he was going to get sick before he even did. She could put her hands on him and she knew what the allergen was that was hurting him. And to me, it was, you know, it was completely invisible to me and made no sense, but she knew it. And and so I knew that I should listen to these mothers. I knew I should listen to them, even though, I was working on the Hudson River for a large part of my career, and I was working for fishermen. And there was often scientific discussion differences between what the scientists were saying in the regulatory agency and what the fishermen would say. And I had this one incident where I had two incidents. One is the Department of Environmental Conservation, New York. I was representing fishermen on the Claverack Creek who were making a living selling goldfish. There was a goldfish population, the biggest goldfish in the world, and they were in the Claverack Creek. Nobody knows where they came from. These people were making a livelihood on them, selling them to pet trade and to collectors. And but then all of a sudden they started disappearing when a new sewage treatment plant started changing its chlorine protocols. I went to the DEC and I said, you know, these fisheries are collapsing, the goldfish fishery. And they said, there is no goldfish in the Hudson River. And I got in this big contest with them. And I knew, because I'd seen the goldfish. So anyway, I knew the experts weren't always right. And another time, I'll tell you this just because it's funny, but I was talking with the head of the DEC when they were they were announcing the ban on the fisheries on the Hudson River. And they went through shad, sturgeon, herring, alewives, blue crab, etc. when they found all the PCBs in them. And at the end, my partner, John Cronin, said, well, what about eel? Because eel wasn't on the list. And the DEC commissioner says, well, we haven't made a determination yet about whether an eel is a snake or a fish. And we were like, that has already been decided. But anyway, so I was skeptical of regulatory agencies and of experts. But one of these women came to my house in Massachusetts in the summer of 2005. And her name was Sarah Bridges. She's a psychologist from Minnesota. And she took a big pile of scientific studies, peer-reviewed studies, and she put them on my front stoop. And she knocked on my door. And when I came out, she pointed to them. She said, "I'm not leaving here till you read these." And so, and I was very accustomed to reading science. It's part of my job. I've had hundreds of lawsuits. Almost all of them involve scientific controversies. So I sat down and I started going through the abstracts on these studies. And before I was 3 or 4 inches in, I recognized that there was a huge delta between what the public health agencies were telling us about vaccine safety and what the actual peer-reviewed science was saying. And so I did what I always did, which is because of my name, my notoriety, I could get people on the telephone. So I started calling, and particularly my family was deeply embedded with the public health regulatory agencies. My uncle for 50 years was chair of the health committee, so he wrote the budgets for them. And my family had created a lot of the sub-agencies and had funded them and written a lot of the laws. I knew, everybody in my family knew Anthony Fauci and Francis Collins. And I started calling them. I called up Francis Collins. I called up Kathleen Stratton, who was the chief staffer at the Institute of Medicine at the National Academy of Sciences. I called Marie McCormick, who was the chair of the Institute of Medicine. And I started asking them questions. And the question I was asking them was this: you're recommending, and virtually every state recommends that pregnant women don't eat certain kinds of fish because of the mercury content. And yet you're recommending flu shots that have many, many times that amount of mercury exposures in 2 pregnant women in every trimester of pregnancy. And none of them could answer. And the weird thing was, they said to me, and I recognized, one, that these were the top regulators in this area, and they were not conversant with the science. Number 2, they all did the same thing, which is to recommend that I talk to somebody who was the real expert, who they said was Paul Offit. Now, Paul Offit is a vaccine developer. He made, he sold his rotavirus vaccine for $186 million to Merck. And he sits at the Merck chair at the University of Pennsylvania. Oh, he's an insider in the vaccine industry. So, this to me struck me as weird, because it would be like if I called EPA and said, why do you have this regulation on mine tailings at coal mines that are allowing it to get into the water? And they said, we don't really know. We called the head of Massey Coal or Peabody Coal. And that would worry me that these guys were sending me to an industry guy. So I got Paul Offit on the phone, and Paul Offit was very respectful to me and very, he said, I got into public health because of your dad, and he inspired me. So I was inclined to, like him. But then I started asking the question, and I asked him that question. And he said to me, kind of in a very patronizing way, well, Bobby, the thing is, there are 2 kinds of mercury. There's a good mercury and there's a bad mercury. And at that point, I was like, I know a lot about mercury because I litigated it. And I knew that his argument was not with me, it was with the periodic tables, because there is no good mercury. But he said the methyl mercury in fish, it has a long residency time in the body. And the ethyl mercury in vaccines is excreted almost immediately because it doesn't have a residency time. It doesn't have time to do any damage. So I had already read a lot of that stuff. And I knew that that was a canard that had been hatched by Eli Lilly in 1932 when they were selling thimerosal, which is a mercury preservative and adjuvant. to the regulatory agencies, but they had no science for it. But then in 2004, a study had come out by a CDC scientist called Picciero, which I had read. And Picciero had looked at monkeys, macaque monkeys. He had given them tuna fish, and then he had measured the mercury in their blood, and the mercury was still there 64 days later. And then he had injected them with thimerosal vaccines, and the thimerosal disappeared from their blood within a week. So there was a great sigh of relief in the industry and in the regulatory agencies, because they said, oh, this is what we've been telling the public for so long, and it actually turns out to be true. Well, but when Picciero published that study, he immediately, the Lancet began getting letters immediately saying, wait a minute, what happened to the mercury? And Boyd Haley, who was the chair of the chemistry department at University of Kentucky and is one of the global authorities on mercury toxicity, said Picciero pointed out that Picciero looked for the mercury in the urine of the children, the sweat, the hair, the fingernails, and the feces, and he could not find it. And so the NIH then paid another scientist, a team of scientists at the University of Washington, led by a very famous scientist called Thomas Burbacker, to actually do studies on macaque monkeys. And he gave half the monkeys tuna fish sandwiches and half them thimerosal shots. And then and the same thing happened. He found the same result. The ethyl mercury disappeared almost immediately from the blood, and the methyl mercury had a long residence time. When he sacrificed the monkeys and did brain scans, what he found was that the mercury had not left. It had not been excreted. It had simply crossed the blood-brain barrier. And it crossed the blood-brain barrier much more easily than methyl mercury in fish. And it had immediately metabolized into organic mercury, which is the most toxic form of that molecule. And it was causing chronic inflammation of the brain. And we now know that for 27 years, you can still find it there. And it's cumulative. So I knew that when I was talking to Offit, because I'd read all those studies. And when he said, I said, how do you know that it leaves the blood? And he said, well, there's a study by Picciero. And I said, but how about the Burbacker studies, which NIH funded? And there was dead silence on the phone. And then he said, well, you're right. It's not a single study. It's a whole mosaic of studies. And I said, can you cite them for me? And he said, I'll get back to you. And that's the last I ever heard from him. Oh, I know those studies don't exist because I went out in 2014 and I compiled every study ever done on mercury and vaccines and every study ever done on autism and vaccines at that time. I found 1,400 references. I digested over 400 studies and published in a book, and it was definitive. And I thought, when I publish this book, it's all going to be over because it's right there in black and white in front of people. This is the cause of all these neurological injuries. Firstly, one of them, it's contributing and it's clear. They had, bench studies, animal studies, they had retrospective studies, they had placebo-controlled studies and done by the top institutions, by NIH, by CDC, published in the Lancet, et cetera. And I just thought the controversy was going to be over. And that's when I found out that this whole orthodoxy is utterly impervious to facts and to reality. And that, is something we all figure out. We all have this shocking moment. Anybody who's dealing with this, whether you are injured, like Bree here, and you say, oh, when I report this, people are going to be upset about it and they're going to do something. And then you find this kind of brick wall that is just stunning, and you start having to reevaluate your whole world. And what I learned briefly, and I don't know how much time I have, but because there's there's a hard leave. You know, there was when I was a kid, I got 3 vaccines. I was fully compliant. And by the way, all of my kids are fully vaccinated. I wish I could go back and unvaccinate them because, you know, I'm not anti-vaccine any more than I'm anti-medicine. If somebody shows me there's a placebo-controlled study that compares vaccinated population to an unvaccinated population, and the vaccinated population is healthier after 5 years, I would give that to myself or to anybody in a second. There'd be no resistance. But unfortunately, those studies are never done. And how do I know they're never done? Because I've litigated that fact. And, you know, for many years, I was saying not a single one of the 72 doses of 16 vaccines now mandated for our children has ever been tested in a pre-licensing study. And Tony Fauci was saying that I was giving vaccine misinformation. And so when President Trump asked me to run the Vaccine Safety Commission, for a brief time, we were putting it together, and he was making all these guys meet with me. Tony Fauci, Francis Collins, Peter Marks, all of these people were forced to have these very unpleasant meetings with me. I just saw Aaron Siri come in. Aaron, are you here? Yeah, so Aaron actually came to these meetings with me, and at the meeting, I said to Tony Fauci, you know, there was like a White House referee there. And I said to Tony Fauci, you keep saying I'm not telling people the truth. It hurts my feelings. I didn't say that, it didn't, but I knew that he was just at that point who he was. And he said, I said, can you show me a single study, a single placebo-controlled study for any of the 72 vaccines pre-licensure? And he started looking through this Redwell, you know, a file folder. They had a big push cart full of file folders there that they were going to pull out. And he started looking through them for a while and made like a show of that. And then he said, they're back at Bethesda, at our office there. And I said, will you send it to me? And he said, or send me a link. And he said, yeah. And of course, he never did. So Aaron and I sued HHS and said, can you show us one study, just one, for any vaccine? And after a year of litigation, they came back and said, no, we don't have any. So none of them have ever been studied. So nobody knows the risk profile for these products, and nobody can tell you that this product, this particular vaccine, is averting more problems than it's causing. And the problem is, as you know, and I heard people refer to it here, when they passed the Vaccine Act in 1972, the reason they passed it is because in the mid-70s, they brought forth a DTP vaccine, diphtheria, tetanus, and pertussis. That vaccine was causing severe brain damage or killing 1 out of every 300 kids. The reason we know that is because NIH paid for a study by UCLA at that time. And they were the UCLA scientists who were doing these studies. We have their letters and their memorandum, and they were really disturbed by what was happening, but they were very open that this is a very dangerous vaccine. So they got rid of that vaccine. In this country, in Europe, we still give that, and we switch with the attenuated version. Bill Gates and WHO still give that vaccine to 161 million African children every year. So, and by the way, Gates has been telling people for 30 years, or for a long time, this vaccine has saved 30 million children. And what he does, he goes to the Western governments and says, give me your foreign policy budget and foreign aid budgets, and I'm going to go and save children's lives. So he went to the Danish government and he said, will you support the TTP program? And the Danish government said, you say it saves 30 million people. And he said, yeah. And they said, do you have any studies that show that? And he said, no. So they said, we're going to do a study. And they went to Guinea-Bissau, where the Danes have this incredible health service. They have 30 years of data on that vaccine. And every child in that country is given the vaccine at either 3 months or 6 months. And so it was a perfect natural experiment, because half the children were given at 3 months, half at 6 months. And they were able then to look at 30 years of data. And the researchers, the Danish government paid for the study, along with Novo Nordisk, which is one of the big vaccine companies, and the Norwegian government. And what they found was that girls who got that vaccine were 10 times more likely to die over the next 3 months than girls who didn't. And they weren't dying of any of the target diseases of diphtheria, tetanus, and pertussis. They were dying of anemia, of bilharzia, of malaria, of a pulmonary and respiratory disease. Most of them died of pneumonia. And for 30 years, nobody had ever looked and said, had ever made the connection, said, it's only the vaccinated girls who are dying. But when they looked at this study, the researchers who were, the very, very famous Peter A. Abbe, who's kind of a deity of vaccine research, very pro-vaccine, Sigrid Morgensen, these very famous scientists said this vaccine is killing more children than the disease was prior to the introduction of the vaccine. And they published that study in 2017. It's called Morgensen. It's in eBiopharma. And those scientists had their careers ruined subsequently because they had crossed the red line. They had actually told the truth about vaccines. Well, anyway, the DTP vaccine in this country had caused all these injuries prior to us getting rid of it. And Wyeth went to the Reagan White House. By the way, my uncle was head of the health committee at that time. And they said, either you give us immunity from liability, or we and the other, they said, we are losing $20 in downstream liability for every dollar we're making in profits and in sales. And they said, unless you give us immunity from liability, we are going to shut down vaccine production. And Reagan said to them, to his credit, he said, why don't you make the vaccine safe? And they said, because vaccines are unavoidably unsafe. And that phrase is in the preamble of the VICA statute. And it's in the Brucewitz decision, which upheld the VICA statute. When people tell you they're safe and effective, the industry is saying they're unavoidably unsafe. So there is a cognitive dissonance there at some point. And really, like every medication, it's a risk appraisal. And to me, the individual needs to be able to make that appraisal themselves and not be forced on people. Anyway, so somebody mentioned when we were up there that when the panel was up there that the passage of VICA in 1986 triggered this gold rush of new vaccines, because now the industry, think about this, has the perfect product. First of all, they're exempt from pre-licensing safety studies, and somebody pointed out the reason for that is because the Public Health Service, which was originally in charge of vaccines, was a quasi-military agency from which the CDC descended. And that agency the vaccines for that agency were primarily a national security defense against biological attacks in our country. So they wanted to make sure that if the Russians attacked us with anthrax or some other biological agent, we could quickly formulate and then deploy a vaccine to 200 million American civilians with no regulatory impediments. And they said, if we treat this like a regular medicine, we'll have to go through 5 years of safety and efficacy trials, and we can't afford to do that. We need to get it out there right away. So we'll call it a biologic, and we will exempt biologics from pre-licensing safety studies. So that's kind of how it evolved. So now they have a product for which there's no downstream liability, which is the biggest cost to every medicine. The product now does not require pre-licensing safety trials, which is probably a saving of $250 million for them. And it has no marketing advertising costs because the federal government is going to order 76 million kids to take this vaccine whether they like it or not. And the vaccine, any industry that looked at this product would say this is the perfect business to be in. There's no cost. The federal government pays for anything, and there's no liability, and there's no accountability. And there's no marketing. You just get, you get them to stamp it at FERPAC and ACIP, and you're good to go. It's $1 billion a year guaranteed. So there was a gold rush, and they put all these vaccines on the schedule, many of which are not even for casually contagious diseases like hepatitis B and rotavirus. And the chance of children getting hepatitis B, except from their mother, for which they're all tested, is essentially zero. And yet the risks of that vaccine are extremely high. So you had this explosion that in 1989, that gold rush started. You had this explosion of chronic disease. At the same time, 3 categories. I mean, you had SIDS start, in the 70s, but explode in 89. So much they had to redefine it into about 6 different categories in order to hide the explosion. And then you had these neurological diseases like that I never saw with kids when I was growing up. I had 11 siblings. I had about 70 cousins. And I didn't know, I never saw these diseases: ADD, ADHD, speech delay, language delay, tics, Tourette's syndrome, narcolepsy, ASD, autism. Autism went from 1 in every 10,000 people in my generation to 1 in 34 today. And one of the things the industry does, which is part of protecting the orthodoxy, is to say, well, we're just noticing it for the first time. It's the result of changing diagnostic criteria, better recognition. And this is, this is just a canard. Missing autism is like missing a train wreck. You can't do it. And by the way, there's been study after study after study. The California legislature ordered UC Davis, the Mind Institute, to do a study on, is the autism epidemic real? And every study has come back and said, yeah, it's real. It's not diagnostic criteria. It's not better recognition. I was living in kind of the spirit at the center of intellectual disabilities from when I was a little boy. My aunt Eunice Shriver started Special Olympics. My cousin Anthony Shriver started Best Buddies. I worked for 200 hours in Wassaic Home for the Retarded as a kid. I never saw a kid when I was growing up with full-blown autism. To this day, I have never seen somebody my age with full-blown autism. And by full-blown autism, I mean stimming, toe walking, head banging, nonverbal, non-toilet trained. In my generation, it's still 1 in 10,000. In my kids' generation, 1 in 34 kids have the diagnosis, and as many as half of them look like that. And so we know that it's real. And why aren't we asking that? And we also know that it started in 1989. How do we know that? Because Congress ordered EPA to tell us what year did it start. And EPA came back with a study. And EPA is a captive agency, but it's captive by chemical, coal, oil, not by pharma. So they came back and did an honest study. They said 1989, it's a red line. But autism isn't the only other thing that started that year. You also had these autoimmune diseases that I never saw as a kid, like rheumatoid arthritis, juvenile diabetes, just blow up. 100 other autoimmune diseases, allergic diseases, like peanut allergies, food allergies, anaphylaxis, eczema. I never heard of eczema. Why do 2 of my kids have eczema? Why is it in every classroom? So, and I'll tell you something about food allergies. My child was so food allergic. It was to keep him alive was just it was a daily terror. So I helped start a group called the Food Allergy Initiative. It later became Food Allergy Network. And one of my partners was David Koch, who ran Koch Energy, who's a guy I had probably at that time 20 lawsuits against. But he had a kid who was the same age as my son, who had the same food allergies. And we started this with a bunch of people. We raised a couple $100 million to study food allergies. And we poached all the best scientists from every institution in our country to come to New York and do this. So they were studying food allergies in a way, if they weren't studying where do they come from, nobody will study that. But they were studying how to treat them, how to cure them. And so they would take rats and they would induce food allergies in them, peanuts or whatever, and then they would devise different ways of treating them. Well, how do you induce a food allergy in a rat? Here's how you do it. You take the aluminum adjuvant from the hepatitis B vaccine and you give it to that rat with a peanut protein. Or if you want to induce a dairy allergy, you do it with a dairy protein. Or a latex allergy, you do it with a latex protein. So, we're giving that adjuvant 5 times to every kid, beginning with the day they're born. And a lot of the vaccines have peanut oil excipients in them. But we also know if there's something in the environment, that in the ambient environment, when you have that aluminum adjuvant in you, you could develop an allergy to that too. So, for example, if there's a Timothy weed outbreak, now you may have a lifetime allergy to Timothy weed. And there's 2 studies by Mawson and Cowlings that show that children who are vaccinated have 30 times the level of allergic rhinitis as children who are unvaccinated. So you have all of this panoply of chronic disease that erupted. We went from having 6% of our children have chronic disease to in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. By 86, as the vaccine schedule is exploding, that went up to a 12.8%. By 2006, it's 54%. More than half our kids are debilitated by these allergies and by chronic diseases. And so we have the 6th generation of children in history, and we have the 6th generation of any other nation. We have also happen to have the most vaccine, the most aggressive vaccine schedule. Now, I can't tell you all of these diseases are coming from vaccines because NIH won't fund those studies. I can tell you there's a lot of independent science that says they are, and I can tell you this, that every one of those diseases is listed as a vaccine side effect on the manufacturer's inserts of at least one of those 72 doses of vaccines. Oh, and that is the only place the vaccine industry will be honest with you. Why is that? Because under VICA, the only way that you can sue a vaccine company is if they knew about an injury and they fail to list it on their manufacturer's insert. That's the one place they're honest. And what the industry will say, what their talking point is, what Paul Offit will say, they'll say, well, those companies, to protect themselves from liability, just throw everything but the kitchen sink into that manufacturer's insert so they got everything covered. That's not true. The federal law says, the Code of Federal Regulations say, you cannot list an injury on the manufacturer's insert unless FDA believes it to be caused by vaccines. So you have this coincidence where all of these diseases that suddenly became epidemic in '89 are all listed on a product that suddenly became ubiquitous in '89. And I do not believe that all of these injuries are caused by vaccines. I think that vaccines are a huge contributor, that our children are swimming around in a toxic soup right now. And, and we have cell phones that are permeating the blood-brain barrier and letting anything in. We have glyphosate, which, operated on became ubiquitous on the same timeline. We have neonicotinoid pesticides. We have atrazine. We have PFOAs, PFAS, these flame retardants and other forever chemicals. And we are just bombarding our children with these substances that are challenging their immune systems. And the immune systems that we developed, that God and evolution gave us, are incredibly resilient and tough and robust. But, there's only so much they can take. And these chemical assaults are ultimately cumulative. And, what I say is, if it's not the vaccines, then let's figure out what it is. Let's do that science and stop pretending that this chronic disease epidemic is not happening. Let us actually do the science. Anyway, yeah, I was told there was a hard stop at 6 o'clock, so I just went over the line. But anyway, thank you all very, very much.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. Not to be giving you the rush here, but we got to flip this room for another use. So thank you and bye. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.